Okay, so we're going to have a little conversation here about color in Photoshop. And so let's go ahead and just hop right into this. So when we go about adjusting colors in Photoshop, there's a tool we use that can have a couple different names. I'll get into that in a second. But let's just get some terms out of the way that we need to be familiar with in order to basically be able to use Photoshop effectively. And these are terms that you may be familiar with, but I want to give you a definition in terms of how Photoshop uses them. So let's start off with the most basic term, and that's hue. Hue is the pure or actual color based on the wavelength of light. Um, as we know, colors are basically waves that travel, and they're carried by light. And there's no such thing as white light. It's white light is a combination of all the colors in the spectrum. But really, as far as that is important to you guys, is that hue is something we will adjust. Hue is something we'll need to get right. And we'll need to know where the controls are that help us do that. But the term hue just simply refers to the color. So again, hue is just which color are you working with? And as you can see, we have a scale of different hues down here. And again, beyond that, there's not a whole lot you need to know except for the fact that when you go to adjust the hue, you will be changing the color. Now, and it's interesting to say that our colors in Photoshop are actually made up of multiple bits and pieces. And what I mean by that is it's not just the hue that defines how the color looks. The next thing that also plays in is saturation, and it's also called chroma, and it's the measure of purity of the color. It refers to its intensity, its vibrance, or its brilliance. And if you look at this chart right here, you can see that a fully saturated color basically lacks gray, black, and white. To desaturate a color, you weaken it by basically adding gray to it, or removing the saturation from it, leaving you with the gray might be a better way to talk about it. And then finally, let's talk about brightness. Now, in some cases, this is referred to luminance, referred to as luminance. In fact, in most of the sliders that I work with, we're gonna see this as luminance, but it is the same as brightness. And that's really all it means, is how bright is the image. It's the amount of light or dark or the shade or tint of a color. So you can see that in order to change brightness, we basically just add in white, gray, or black. And depending on how this is mixed with the color over here, will give us an understanding of the brightness of the color. So we see that even though we tend to think of color in just terms of color, saturation and brightness also have a very marked effect on colors. Now let's just take a quick look at how this works in Photoshop. If I grab this window over here, and for those of you that are still getting familiar with the work area, this is our color palette. And if you don't see this, we can use this as a color picker to define our foreground and background colors over here. And for those of you who maybe aren't seeing this, you can always go up to Window and just put a check mark next to the word color. And you can see it's actually so important that it's got a key command. So F6 or maybe FN F6, depending on how your keyboard is set up, will get this window open. And then if you come up to these little, it looks like 4 tiny little lines, you'll notice that each panel has one of these little drop downs. And what this does is it controls what we're able to see in the panel. So if I open this up, I can actually come to my HSB slider. So let's open that up. So now if we come over here and select a color, let's select something like, light blue, put it right there. So you can see that it basically looks at the hue, saturation, and brightness of where I selected the color from. Now, obviously hue is pretty easy to see here. We've got our red and our yellow and our green and blue and purple and so on. And then you can see that saturation is going to be basically controlled by how close you get to the middle of this color. or actually how far you get to the middle and sort of the top up here. As we see, saturation has its own slider, and right now everything is set to full saturation. But with brightness, you'll notice that just by picking in the middle there, I was definitely not adding a whole lot of white or a whole lot of black. So let's consider this initial selection just a rough selection. In fact, let's switch it to green. And you can see that we've got our hue right here, and that's just, again, a slider version of what we're seeing here. We've got our saturation all the way up to 100%. And you can see our brightness is just a little bit brighter than it is dark. It's not quite at 50%. So it's just a touch brighter. Now, again, this is me selecting with an eyedropper, but you can absolutely come in here and modify your color selection. Let's slide our board over here a little bit. You can modify your color selection, change the hue, adjust the saturation as well. And you'll see that if we were to select, this is the color we ended up with, basically. After making these adjustments, all I did, just so you can understand, after making these adjustments, it automatically loads that color that we've selected right here into our color picker. Now, again, one thing that will really help you down the road is understanding that Photoshop has 25 different ways of doing the exact same thing. So the fact is, you could be a full-time graphic designer using Photoshop in every single project and never open this window. The reason I say that is because if I come over here and double click on the foreground color, I have all those same controls right here. See this HSB? So this allows me to essentially get these same controls right here in this window. And if I click on, say, H, that's going to be my hue slider. And you notice how that gives me all of my hues. And generally speaking, the most saturated point is usually this upper right corner. That's going to give you the most saturated version of any of these colors. But you can always click on S for saturation. And you'll see that, again, it's defaulting to that top line. And I do have this control right here that will allow me to desaturate these colors. And as you see, as I take it down, we lose a lot of saturation. And then, of course, brightness as well. And now we have our brightest area at the bottom here, but if I move this slider down, it will darken my colors. So you can see that you have the same mixture of tools by just double clicking on your foreground color. But for you, you might enjoy working in this color window. And for that reason, it's there. I'll be honest, I almost never use this color window because I feel like most of what I can get done right here in the standard color picker. And if you're not sure about foreground color and background color, all that means is it's basically something that Photoshop lets us do. It lets us pick a foreground and a background color. And what I like about that is that I can have two colors kind of on command. So if I hit the B key right now, and let me double click on this layer here. Let's see, layer 1. There we go. So I've basically pulled up my brush. And if I hit the left bracket to make it smaller, you can see that when I go to paint, and let's make sure our flow is set to 100, because I've been doing some low flow painting lately. And we'll set our brush to hard. You can see that if I paint, I get a nice green line. And that's my foreground color. That's the color I'm always going to see when I paint. But the nice thing about the color picker is that by hitting the X button, it will shuffle. It will basically toggle between these two. So if I hit X, you can see that it switches my foreground to my background. So now if I draw again, you'll see the blue comes out. And so this is just a really nice way to be able to quickly toggle between multiple colors. Another thing that's really great about this is that if you want to reset it to black and white, you can just click on these little black and white icons right there, and that will set you back to black. And if I hit X, same thing happens. Now I've got white. So that right there is something you will use every time you use the color picker. So make sure that you get real familiar with the fact that the X key will toggle between those. Make sure you get comfortable with the idea that you can always reset to 100% black and 100% white by simply clicking on this little button right here. And if you want to switch them, again, there's a button here to allow you to switch them. But again, you've got the X key, which just does the exact same thing and does it so much faster. And when we get into masking, you'll really see the value of this black and white. But we can also use it for dodging and burning and plenty of other things. So that is hue, saturation, and brightness. Now, what's interesting, and sometimes it's referred to as an HSB setting. What's interesting is if I come down to my adjustment layers, which are right here in this little half colored in circle, that I do have a hue saturation adjustment right here. But for some reason, and it does the exact same thing. There's hue, saturation, but they call it lightness rather than brightness. And sometimes they call it luminance. It means the exact same thing. Why they can't get their terms straight, I have no idea. If we were to pull this into the camera raw adjustment, which is just another work environment with another set of tools. And of course, you can go to filter, camera raw. I prefer to use the keyboard shortcut, Command Shift A. And if we open up this image, Command Shift A, you'll see that now we're in the camera raw setting. And let's see here. Did I select the wrong layer? Let's see. Maybe it's just taking a second to load, or let's switch our profile. That's unusual. Let me double check, make sure I'm not doing anything wrong. We'll go up to here. We'll go to image mode. We're in RGB. So I'm not sure why that was coming out. Oh, let's see. You know what it was? I had the adjustment layer selected. So we'll select the actual layer with the color in it and then hit Shift Command A. And there we go. Now we have our image in camera raw. Now this, for me, even if I'm not working on raw images, this is my favorite area to do my color adjustment. And the reason, to a large degree, is because I also use a program called Lightroom, and did a photo shoot recently. And if I go to the develop module, it is exactly the same as what we find here in Photoshop. So really, for me, it's more conditioning. I've been conditioned to use this camera raw color adjustment. So I touched on this in the last video, but again, this is going to do the same thing. If I come down to the color mixer, I can come down right here and you'll notice that I see hue, saturation, and luminance. Now, again, to be absolutely clear, you don't have to use this window. You can use your regular Photoshop window with any adjustments that you have available in the adjustment layers, or up in the filters, or the image layers. But again, because I work in mostly raw images, and the fact that you don't have to use raw images, I prefer to use this camera raw editing suite. And you can see it's got a lot of different options. So the basic is going to have things like exposure, contrast, and we'll get to those in a second. But if we go to color mixer, that's where you find hue, saturation, and luminance. Again, the same things we're talking about right here. And the nice thing about this is that it allows you to target individual colors. If I want to just desaturate my reds, I can grab the red slider and notice all my reds are just about completely desaturated. If I went and got my magentas, I'm not sure exactly what else I would have to desaturate to get that to go completely gray, but there we go, the oranges. So if I take the oranges down, you can see that my reds are now completely black and white. So again, I can do the exact same thing using an HSL adjustment layer. Here we have an hue saturation adjustment layer. I added this. Now remember, this is an effect that lives on its own layer, which is great because it means I can turn it off, I can delete it, I can go back and change it. Whereas the camera raw color suite is a little more, I don't want to say permanent, because you can always go back and change your settings. but it's not as easily changed as this. Because again, I can just toggle this on and off. So if I want to use this adjustment layer, I simply click right here. And at first you'll see that we have hue, saturation, and lightness. But we can also target individual colors by coming up here to where it says master and changing that to red. And now I can desaturate my reds. And as you see, I don't have to get the oranges too. Now we get this range down here. This is the red range. If I want to go further, I can expand it. And so it'll start to sort of feather. This area between here and here is the feather, and I'm not sure how I managed to go completely black and white there. There we go. But this area in the middle is the color that's being adjusted. And if I bring this in so that it's not selecting as much, there's a chance we might get some of our reds back, because now we're selecting less of the red channel, and notice we start to see some reds popping back in here. So if there's a specific color, you know, I deal with a lot of yellows and unwanted yellows and unwanted blues. And if you know anything about photography, that's essentially a white balance issue. And so a lot of times I'll come in here and just desaturate my yellows just a little bit to get skin tones looking natural, or to remove unwanted tungsten light on a wall. So the point is, this can be done by pulling up this window, going to color, hitting the drop down, and using this window. You could also, to get the exact same effect, come down to this half circle and add a HSL or hue saturation adjustment layer, which again, if I decide to do something drastic, like completely saturate everything, I can always toggle it off. Or I could click on it and just maybe adjust its opacity slightly. Yeah. So you've got lots of levels of control, and that's what I really want to show you. And of course, if I turn it off, we also have the option of going to image. Let's see here, select my layer, make sure my layer is selected, not the adjustment layer. I could go to image, adjustments, and there's another hue saturation. And this one is exactly the same as this one, except this one will be applied directly to the layer. We can go back and adjust it, but it's not quite as easy to adjust as an adjustment layer per se. So between image, adjustment, hue saturation, or Command U, as we learned in the last tutorial, or the option of going to hue saturation as an adjustment layer, which just means that effect lives on its own layer. It's not burned into any of these layers. It can always be turned on or turned off, or grab it and delete it. And of course, Shift Command A opens up Camera Raw, which has a lot of the exact same options. And notice we can come in here and change this to color, although I can honestly say I've never done that. I always just use the HSL because it seems a little easier. No need to change what works perfectly. So that is introduction to the HSL slider. Again, we talked about it a lot last week in our colorizing video. Now let's just talk about a few more, and I'm going to try to end this video in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So moving forward, we also have things like tint and shade. So what does this mean, and how do we use it? Well, tint is simply the act of adding white to a color. Everything between red and white are tints. So you'll see right here we have full saturated red in the middle, and we can tint it white. Again, if you're working in the print industry or the graphic design industry, you need to be able to communicate clearly. And if someone says, you know, why don't you tint that red a little bit, you need to understand that they're actually saying, why don't you lighten that red? The same thing goes for adding black to a color. Shading a color means to add black. So they might say, let's shade that red down a little bit. They just mean to darken it up. That's it. Again, these are terms you'll need to understand. You'll need to memorize these so that if you do find yourself working in a graphic design environment, you can speak clearly and effectively. Moving forward, let's look at tonal range. Now, tonal range is something that's very important to me. As a filmmaker, as a photographer, and as a video editor, highlights, shadows, and midtones are so important. So let's just talk about what they are. First off, this is the tonal range, and this can be described a lot of different ways. I've also heard this referred to as dynamic range. If you're talking about a camera and how much it can expose before it falls into 100% black or 100% white, the range between is often called the dynamic range. If you have black, gray, and white and nothing else but those three colors, then you have a very limited tonal range or dynamic range. But if you have lots of space between what we call 50% gray or our mid-gray, if you have lots of these sort of gradients between here and you're 100% white, then you have a wide tonal range or a wide dynamic range. That said, highlights, midtones, and shadows are things we are always working with. And again, you can see a great example of these if you hit Shift-Command-A. Of course, selecting the layer is essential. Shift-Command-A. That's going to take us back into Camera Raw. And as you see right here, if we come up to basic editing, you'll see that there are those things exactly as we see them here. Shadows, highlights, and we don't see midtones. Basically, in this case, this is a little bit different from what we're going to see here. These highlights, shadows, and exposure and blacks and whites all they all relate to a specific spot on our histogram. If you watch me kind of scrub my mouse across this histogram, you see those gray lines in there? Those are in direct reference to these sliders, which is a way of saying basically I don't even have to grab the sliders. I could just put my mouse right up here, click and drag, and look what's happening. It's getting darker. And look at where that darken, look at which slider is moving. The center of my image is my exposure slider. That's just my overall brightness of the entire image. If I come over to right here, you'll see this is going to be my highlights. So while this tonal chart says that your highlights are at the very edge, the fact is the very edge is actually your whites and blacks. It should also say whites right here and blacks right here. Because the way that Camera Raw looks at shadows and highlights, it looks at them more as midtones. And so notice if I go right here, if I go, let's see, like right there. Okay, you see this area? I'm not at the very edge of my blacks. I'm in the shadows. And look at as I drag, look at which slider is being adjusted. My shadows slider. So shadows aren't your absolute darkest area. That is your blacks. If I come over here, now you see my black slider sliding. Shadows and highlights, as far as Camera Raw is concerned, are your midtones. So that's good to know. We'll see exactly how that plays into things as we move forward. We're going to come back in just a few minutes and I'll start a little video and we'll talk about some basic color theory.